Navigating the personal and the political at the height of the anti-apartheid movement. In April 1960, officials banned the ANC and a rival organization, the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, after women and men's rising anti-pass activism and escalating police violence against protesters. From this point forward, until February 1990, the major liberation movements went underground, with key leaders in exile, imprisoned, repeatedly detained, or personally banned. All of these assaults on leaders were profoundly disruptive to family life. Women lost organizational autonomy in the interest of streamlining underground operations. In 1969, the ANCWL was replaced by the ANC Women's Section, which Hassim describes as turning into the movement's social worker. Iconography of women and families played an integral role in an increasingly global anti-apartheid movement. This movement was shaped both by new armed wings of the ANC and PAC, launched in 1961, and by a transnational civil societal campaign, encouraging boycotts and diplomatic pressure on the apartheid regime that grew stronger after South Africa left the British Commonwealth in 1961. Within South Africa, women's social and cultural work fueled a new movement called Black Consciousness, rooted among students and workers across the country from the late 1960s. Black consciousness activism would explode in a wave of student protests against Bantu education in 1976, which began in the Johannesburg township of Soweto, but turned into a national schools boycott after police massacred student protesters. After 1976, new waves of activists, especially youth, fled South Africa, and the country's international pariah status worsened. Women were a minority of armed combatants, plotting sabotage from across South Africa's borders. But both the iconography and presence of women has attracted attention, particularly from scholars of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, MK, or Spear of the Nation. Conspicuous in MK's propaganda were images of what scholar Kim Miller has called moms with guns, women with babies on their backs, weapons in hand, and fury in their eyes. Female MK members could experience a thrilling sense of equality with men, particularly in cases where women held rank, and women performed critical roles, smuggling weapons into South Africa. But women were also confronted with sexism and harassment from their comrades, the product of the very male-dominated atmosphere of MK camps. Most troubling for many MK women were the ANC's policies on pregnancy and childbearing, which reflected the essential contradictions between discourses and realities of family in the anti-apartheid struggle. Pregnancy was supposed to be forbidden for MK women, with some forcibly fitted with IUDs. MK women did inevitably become pregnant, however, especially after new waves of young activists flocked into MK camps from 1976, and as the camps faced prolonged periods of minimal activity, plotting, and training for many military expeditions that never occurred. Pregnant women would be sent to the ANC's Charlotte Maxeke Mother and Child Center in Morogoro, Tanzania, which they understood as a punishment, as this remote exile within exile took them away from camps in the frontline states. By the late 1980s, the women's section complained to the party officials of years of demanding daycare facilities near MK camps so that women could be mothers while preparing as soldiers, without result. Quote, "We seem to travel in a dead-end street, with marriage and babies being at the end of the street. There is not and can never be a contradiction between marriage and having babies on one hand and fighting on the other." End quote. Yet MK women could only be, quote, moms with guns in propaganda. Women had more space in the cultural wings of the global anti-apartheid movement, as ANC President O.R. Tambo particularly supported the deployment of eloquent and engaging women in exile. Women were central to the Maibuye Cultural Ensemble in London, and Barbara Masekela led the ANC's arts and culture wing in the 1980s, for instance. South Africa's most prolific, globally influential anti-apartheid novelist was a middle-class white woman in suburban Johannesburg, Nadine Gordimer. Black women artists in exile, like Miriam Makeba and Loretta Ngcobo, generated support for the anti-apartheid movement in the United States and Europe. Within South Africa, educational institutions became important sites for young women's anti-apartheid thought and organizing. Inanda Seminary, a high school drawing some of the brightest African girls from around the country to its campus near Durban, was an especially lively site during the 1970s. There, young women met visiting activists like Steve Biko, a radical medical student at the nearby University of Natal, and Fatima Mir, an Indian academic activist based at the university. While black women remained severely underrepresented in higher education compared to black men or whites, black girls' high school attendance was rising dramatically during the apartheid years, such that by the early 1980s, more black girls than black boys would be in high school. This was an outcome of apartheid policies promoting the education of black female teachers and nurses to work in new Bantustan schools and clinics, as officials saw women as both cheaper to employ and more politically tractable. As the cases of banned activists setting up politically vibrant rural clinics make clear, women's work in social professions could give them an entree to anti-apartheid organizing. Such work could be particularly politicizing, as women were confronted directly with apartheid's violence, especially in clinics and social work. The Black consciousness movement, while helmed by men like Steve Biko, was undergirded by the work of young women in clinics, schools, and journalism, working to unite black women and men, African, Indian, and colored, to end apartheid. Yet women in black consciousness, like women in the liberation movements in exile, ran up against frustrating gendered limitations. As Mampela Rampela notes of her time as a leader in the South African Students' Organization, the key black consciousness group until its 1977 banning, quote, "I became quite an aggressive debater and was known for not suffering fools gladly. Moreover, I intimidated men who did not expect aggression from women. Soon, a group of similarly inclined women, Vuyelwa Mashalaba, Nomsisi Cry, Deborah Matsoba, and Tenjiwe Mtinzo, became a force to be reckoned with at annual SASO meetings. Ours was not a feminist cause at that time. Feminism was a later development in my political consciousness, but an insistence on being taken seriously as activists in our own right amongst our peers." End quote. Attempts at organizing black consciousness women, such as Fatima Mir and Winnie Mandela's Black Women's Federation in 1975, similarly attempted to develop women's self-assertion while shying away from the label feminism. Hassim's Women's Organizations and Democracy in South Africa has most vividly shown how often anti-apartheid activists, particularly women of color, resisted calling themselves feminists or discussing issues of gender inequity within their movements in public from the 1970s. It was not only that feminism was often rejected as an imported white ideology without indigenous roots. That critique reflected the overrepresentation of white academics in South Africa's second-wave feminist groups, the dramatic differences between the conditions of white and black women's lives, and global moves of African American and Third World women toward less individualistic ideologies like womanism. As state oppression grew more pervasive in the 1980s, with prolonged states of emergency of military rule by mid-decade, feminism could seem a divisive distraction that activists should not indulge. Yet Hassim has also shown how individual women's connections of their experiences with those of other women could lead them, like Mampele, to feminist consciousness. This happened as women grew involved in a resurgent wave of grassroots organizations called township civics as part of the United Democratic Front, UDF, a new above-ground coalition of anti-apartheid groups stressing non-racialism and democracy from 1983. Three major regional women's groups formed: the United Women's Organization in the Western Cape, UWO, the Federation of Transvaal Women, FEDTRO, and the Natal Organization of Women, NOW. These groups were inspired by FEDSAW, which ANC activists were then trying to re-establish within South Africa. An emerging challenge facing women in these movements was how to connect personal issues with the political system that shaped them and that they shaped, against many activist men and women's tendencies to sublimate intimate issues. Activist Phumelele Ntombela Nzimande recalled, quote, "Now comrades were asking, why write about rape all the time? These were seen as weird issues to focus on. They said people should speak about the state of emergency, not about wife battering. Even I don't remember once challenging a NOW meeting to speak about these issues. I just felt overwhelmed by the fact that it wasn't appropriate." End quote. In Natal in particular, the brewing civil war between UDF activists and the Zulu nationalist group Inkatha, sponsored by the apartheid government, put discussion of such issues on the back burner for many activists in the 1980s. But growing sexual violence was a significant part of Natal's political violence, laying the groundwork for the province's high rates of HIV/AIDS after the democratic transition. Throughout the anti-apartheid struggle, women were routinely underestimated and ignored as political actors. Officials' underestimation of women could open up valuable political space. Women running politically lively clinics and schools, for instance, were not seen as threatening, while male-led political groups attracted more censure. Yet the neglect of core issues of gendered inequality as apolitical by many male and female activists left lingering contradictions after apartheid's end. The democratic transition in 1994 was in some respects remarkably progressive on gender and sexuality, with the Constitution enshrining equality and unprecedented rights for LGBTQ citizens. But ANC leaders' compromises with chiefs meant that women living under customary law could not realize this equality. Moreover, everyday gendered inequities in issues from employment to pervasive sexual violence plague post-apartheid society. While South African women undermined apartheid from its gendered core, they have yet to realize core rights of gendered citizenship.